Brad, a young delivery driver, thought he had life all figured out. Confident and quick to judge, he never hesitated to look down on those he believed were beneath him. But today, he's about to face a moment that will shatter his pride and force him to confront the truth about himself. When Brad cruelly mocks an elderly black man, Samuel, for simply trying to survive, he has no idea of the chain reaction he's about to set in motion, one that will lead him down a path he never expected. But what happens when the tables turn, and Brad is faced with the very struggle he once sneered at? And who is the mysterious figure watching from the shadows, connected to Samuel's past in ways he can't even begin to imagine? As we follow this emotional tale of pride, humility, and redemption, we'll see how one act of kindness can transform even the most stubborn hearts. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you're ready to uncover the hidden layers of this incredible journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. In the heart of Millbrook, a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, stood an old apartment building that had seen better days. Its faded brick walls and creaky wooden stairs told stories of countless lives that had passed through over the years. On the third floor, in a small one-bedroom apartment, lived Mr. Samuel Johnson, an elderly black man known throughout the community for his quiet kindness and unwavering dignity. At 72 years old, Mr. Samuel's weathered face bore the lines of a life filled with both joy and hardship. His warm brown eyes, though dimmed by age, still sparkled with a gentle wisdom that drew people to him. Despite the visible signs of poverty in his threadbare clothes and the sparse furnishings of his home, Mr. Samuel carried himself with a grace that commanded respect from all who knew him. As the early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of his apartment, Mr. Samuel slowly rose from his worn armchair, his joints creaking in protest. He shuffled to the kitchen, his slippered feet barely making a sound on the old linoleum floor. Opening the nearly empty refrigerator, he sighed softly, a familiar pang of hunger gnawing at his stomach. "Well, old friend," he murmured to himself, "looks like it's time for another food run." Mr. Samuel's current circumstances were a far cry from his past. Once upon a time, he had been a pillar of the community, a successful businessman whose name was synonymous with generosity and integrity. His small grocery store, Samuel's Fresh Market, had been more than just a place to buy food. It was a hub for the neighborhood, a place where people came not just to shop, but to connect and support one another. For years, Mr. Samuel had run his business with a philosophy that put people before profits. He extended credit to families struggling to make ends meet, donated surplus food to local shelters, and even used his own savings to help community members in dire straits. His kindness knew no bounds, and the people of Millbrook loved him for it. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and Mr. Samuel's generosity eventually caught up with him. A severe economic downturn hit the neighborhood hard, and many of his customers found themselves unable to pay their debts. Rather than pursuing collections aggressively, Mr. Samuel continued to extend credit and provide support, even as his own financial situation grew increasingly precarious. "I can't turn my back on them now," he had told his worried wife, Martha, at the time. "These people are our family. We'll weather this storm together." But the storm proved too fierce. One by one, the dominoes fell. Unpaid bills piled up, suppliers demanded cash up front, and the bank came calling for loan payments. Despite his best efforts, Mr. Samuel was forced to close the store, selling off everything he could to pay his debts and support those who depended on him. In the end, Mr. Samuel lost it all: his business, his savings, and even his family home. Martha, unable to cope with the stress and shame of their financial ruin, left him, taking their grown children with her. Left alone and nearly penniless, Mr. Samuel found himself living in the very community he had once helped to support, now relying on the kindness of others to survive. But even in his darkest hours, Mr. Samuel never lost his dignity or his desire to help others. He began discreetly collecting leftover food from restaurants and grocery stores, not just to feed himself, but to share with other struggling members of the community. His apartment became an unofficial food bank, where those in need could find a meal and a kind word. As Mr. Samuel prepared for his daily food run, across town, a very different scene was unfolding. Brad Thompson, a young white delivery driver for a local restaurant, was starting his shift with his usual air of smugness and superiority. At 25, Brad was the epitome of youthful arrogance. Tall, athletic, and blessed with boyish good looks, he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on cockiness. His perfectly styled hair and trendy clothes spoke of someone who took great pride in his appearance, viewing it as a testament to his success. "Another day, another dollar," Brad announced as he sauntered into the restaurant's kitchen. "Let's see how much I can rake in today." His co-workers exchanged knowing glances, all too familiar with Brad's attitude. To him, every delivery was a competition, every tip a validation of his worth. He saw his job not as a service, but as a personal showcase of his superiority. "Hey, Brad," called out Sarah, one of the kitchen staff. "Don't forget we've got that charity event later this week. They're looking for volunteers to help serve food to the homeless." Brad scoffed, grabbing his delivery bag. "Yeah, right? Like I've got time to waste feeding people who can't be bothered to work for their own food. If they tried half as hard as I do, they wouldn't need handouts." Sarah's face fell, but she knew better than to argue. Brad's views on poverty and success were well known and firmly entrenched. In his mind, financial struggles were always the result of personal failings, never circumstances beyond one's control. As he headed out for his first delivery, Brad's mind was filled with self-congratulatory thoughts. He had moved out of his parents' house at 18, worked his way through community college, and now had a job that allowed him to live comfortably. In his eyes, this was proof that anyone could succeed if they just worked hard enough. "It's all about the hustle," he often boasted to anyone who would listen. "I'm where I am because I earned it. No excuses, no handouts." What Brad failed to recognize was the network of support that had enabled his success. Loving parents who had provided a stable home, access to education, and the absence of systemic barriers that many others faced. In his narrow worldview, these advantages were invisible, overshadowed by his belief in his own exceptional efforts. As he drove through the city streets, Brad's eyes darted from house to house, mentally judging the residents based on the appearance of their homes. Nice car in the driveway? Clearly a hard worker. Overgrown lawn and peeling paint? Must be lazy and unmotivated. Little did Brad know that his path was about to intersect with Mr. Samuel's in a way that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, struggle, and the true measure of a person's worth. As the day wore on, two very different journeys were unfolding. Mr. Samuel, with his quiet dignity, prepared to venture out into the world, hoping to find enough food to sustain himself and help others in need. And Brad, full of misplaced pride and judgment, set out to prove his superiority with every delivery he made. The sun had long since set over Millbrook, casting the city in a blanket of darkness broken only by the occasional streetlight and the glow of neon signs. In the alley behind Enzo's Italian restaurant, the air was thick with the scent of garlic and tomato sauce, remnants of the busy dinner service that had just ended. Mr. Samuel Johnson moved quietly through the shadows, his weathered hands gripping a small, folded canvas bag. He approached the dumpster behind the restaurant with a mixture of determination and shame. Even after all these years, the act of searching for discarded food never got easier. But necessity had long ago overcome pride, and Mr. Samuel knew that tonight's findings could mean the difference between hunger and sustenance for himself and others in need. With practiced ease, he lifted the heavy lid of the dumpster, wincing slightly at the metallic creak that seemed to echo in the quiet alley. Mr. Samuel's eyes, still sharp despite his age, scanned the contents quickly. Years of experience had taught him what to look for: sealed containers, untouched bread, vegetables that were slightly past their prime but still edible. "Lord, grant me strength and humility," he whispered, a prayer he often uttered in these moments. With careful movements, he began to sort through the discarded food, placing salvageable items into his bag. Unbeknownst to Mr. Samuel, he wasn't alone in the alley. From the window of her second-floor apartment overlooking the restaurant, Mrs. Eleanor Anderson watched the scene unfold. Her heart ached as she recognized the dignified figure of Mr. Samuel, a man who had once been her family's savior in their darkest hour. Mrs. Anderson, now a successful businesswoman and philanthropist, had never forgotten the kindness Mr. Samuel had shown her and her mother when she was just a child. She often looked out this window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him and find a way to repay the debt of gratitude she felt she owed. Tonight, as she watched him dumpster diving, she felt a renewed sense of urgency to help the man who had once helped her. As Mrs. Anderson contemplated how to approach Mr. Samuel without wounding his pride, the relative quiet of the alley was shattered by the roar of a motorcycle engine. Brad Thompson, making his last delivery of the night, pulled up behind the restaurant, his customized bike gleaming under the streetlights. Brad killed the engine and swung off his bike with the easy grace of youth, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He was in a good mood. Tips had been generous tonight, and he was looking forward to hitting the bars with his friends later. As he approached the back door of the restaurant to pick up his next delivery, movement by the dumpster caught his eye. At first, Brad thought it might be a stray animal, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized it was a person, an old man, digging through the trash. A sneer of disgust crossed Brad's handsome features, quickly followed by a cruel smirk. "Well, well, well," Brad called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do we have here? Looks like someone's having a fancy dinner tonight." Mr. Samuel froze, his hand halfway into the dumpster. He turned slowly, facing Brad with as much dignity as he could muster. "Young man," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I don't want any trouble. I'll be on my way shortly." Brad laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the alley walls. "Trouble? Nah, old-timer. I'm just admiring your fine dining choices. Tell me, do you prefer your garbage with a side of rats? Or is that too fancy for your tastes?" From her window, Mrs. Anderson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock at the young man's cruelty. She wanted to call out, to intervene, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the fear of embarrassing Mr. Samuel further, or maybe it was a morbid curiosity to see how the scene would play out. Whatever the reason, she remained a silent observer, her heart breaking with every word. Mr. Samuel straightened his back, fixing Brad with a steady gaze. "Son, there's no need for unkindness. We all face struggles in this life, and sometimes we must do what's necessary to survive." Brad's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with malice. "Struggles? Please. The only struggle I see here is your struggle to be a functioning member of society. Tell me, what's your excuse? Too lazy to get a job? Or did you drink away all your money, and now you're paying the price?" Mr. Samuel flinched as if he'd been struck, but he held his ground. "You know nothing about me or my life, young man. It's unwise to judge others when you haven't walked in their shoes." "Oh, spare me the fortune cookie wisdom, old man," Brad scoffed. "I don't need to know your life story to see that you're nothing but a bum. Look at you, scrounging for scraps like a stray dog. It's pathetic." Each word was like a dagger to Mr. Samuel's heart, but he refused to let this arrogant young man see how deeply the insults cut. Instead, he simply shook his head sadly. "I pray that you never find yourself in a situation where you have to eat your own cruel words, son. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way." As Mr. Samuel turned to leave, Brad couldn't resist one final jab. "Yeah, run along now. I'm sure there are plenty of other dumpsters for you to raid. Who knows, maybe if you're lucky, you'll find a nice cardboard box to call home." Laughter echoed in the alley as Brad watched Mr. Samuel shuffle away, his canvas bag clutched tightly to his chest. Only when the old man had disappeared around the corner did Brad turn back to the restaurant, still chuckling to himself. Up in her apartment, Mrs. Anderson was shaking with a mixture of rage and sorrow. She had recognized Brad as one of the regular delivery drivers for the restaurant, and in that moment, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would confront this cruel young man and teach him a lesson about compassion and human dignity. The next day dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the dark events of the previous night. Mrs. Anderson rose early, her mind still churning with thoughts of Mr. Samuel and the callous delivery driver. She dressed with care, choosing an outfit that spoke of authority and success, a tailored navy suit that highlighted her elegant bearing. At precisely 11 a.m., Mrs. Anderson positioned herself outside Enzo's restaurant, knowing that the delivery drivers usually arrived around this time to begin the lunch shift. She didn't have to wait long before the familiar roar of a motorcycle announced Brad's arrival. Brad pulled up to his usual parking spot, oblivious to Mrs. Anderson's presence. As he dismounted and began to walk towards the restaurant, she stepped into his path, her expression stern and unyielding. "Excuse me," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice cool and controlled. "Are you the young man who was working deliveries here last night?" Brad looked up, startled by the sudden confrontation. He quickly recovered, flashing what he thought was a charming smile. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. Brad Thompson, at your service. Is there a problem with an order?" Mrs. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, Mr. Thompson. The problem isn't with an order. It's with your behavior. I witnessed your interaction with an elderly gentleman behind this restaurant last night, and I must say, I was appalled by your cruelty." The smile vanished from Brad's face, replaced by a defensive scowl. "Look, lady, I don't know who you are or what you think you saw, but that's none of your business. That old bum was digging through the trash. I was just having a little fun. A little fun?" Mrs. Anderson's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "What I saw was a young man viciously mocking someone who's clearly struggling. Do you have any idea who that old bum is or what he's been through?" Brad rolled his eyes, his posture becoming increasingly defensive. "Like I said, it's none of my business, and it's definitely none of yours. Why don't you take your moral high ground somewhere else? I've got work to do." But Mrs. Anderson wasn't about to let him off so easily. She stepped closer, her voice lowering to ensure their conversation remained private. "That man you mocked, Mr. Samuel Johnson, is one of the kindest, most generous individuals I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and I owe him everything." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Brad's face. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly owe anything to a guy who digs through dumpsters?" Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath, steeling herself to share a story she rarely spoke about. "When I was a little girl, my mother and I were in a desperate situation. My father had abandoned us, leaving us penniless and on the verge of homelessness. We had nowhere to turn and no one to help us. That is, until we met Mr. Samuel." Despite himself, Brad found he was listening intently. Mrs. Anderson continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Samuel owned a small grocery store back then. When he saw how desperate we were, he didn't just give us food, he gave us hope. He extended credit to my mother when no one else would, ensuring we always had enough to eat. He even helped her find a job, giving her the opportunity to get back on her feet." Brad shifted uncomfortably, but Mrs. Anderson wasn't finished. "Mr. Samuel's kindness didn't stop there. He became a mentor to me, encouraging me to stay in school and pursue my dreams. He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Without his support, I wouldn't be where I am today, a successful businesswoman running my own charity organization." For a moment, Brad was silent, processing this information. Then his defensive walls slammed back into place. "That's a real touching story, lady. But what's your point? Everyone's got sob stories. It doesn't change the fact that the guy's digging through trash now. If he was so great before, he must have made some pretty bad choices to end up where he is." Mrs. Anderson's eyes flashed with anger. "The point, Mr. Thompson, is that you judged and mocked a man without knowing anything about his circumstances. Mr. Samuel lost everything because he spent his life helping others. When the economy took a downturn, he extended himself too far, trying to support his community. He sacrificed his own financial security to help people like my mother and me." Brad scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Yeah, well, that was his choice, wasn't it? Nobody forced him to give away all his money. If you ask me, that just makes him a fool. A fool." Mrs. Anderson's voice was quiet but intense. "Is that what you call someone who puts others before himself? Someone who sees people in need and does everything in his power to help them? If that's foolishness, Mr. Thompson, then perhaps we need more fools in this world." For a brief moment, Brad looked chastened. But then his arrogance reasserted itself. "Look, I get it. The guy did some nice things back in the day, but that doesn't change where he is now. If he was smart, he would have looked out for himself first. That's what I do, and I'm doing just fine." Mrs. Anderson shook her head sadly. "You're missing the point entirely. Success isn't just about how much money you have or how comfortable your life is. It's about the impact you have on others, the lives you touch. Mr. Samuel may have lost his material wealth, but the richness of his character and the legacy of kindness he's created far outweigh any bank balance." Brad's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape from this conversation. Whatever. You can glorify poverty all you want, but I'm not buying it. Everyone's responsible for their own success or failure. If that old man is eating out of dumpsters, that's on him. Mrs. Anderson sighed, realizing that her words were falling on deaf ears. I had hoped that sharing this story might open your eyes to the dangers of judging others without knowing their full story. But I see now that you're not ready to hear it. I just pray that life doesn't have to teach you this lesson the hard way. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Anderson paused, fixing Brad with a final, penetrating look. Remember this, Mr. Thompson. The measure of a person isn't in how much they have, but in how much they give. And by that measure, Mr. Samuel Johnson is the richest man I know. With those parting words, Mrs. Anderson walked away, leaving Brad standing alone outside the restaurant. For a moment, he remained motionless, her words echoing in his mind. Then, with a shake of his head, he pushed the encounter aside and headed into work, determined to forget about the whole thing. But as Brad started his shift, he couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of his stomach. Despite his best efforts to dismiss Mrs. Anderson's words, they had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a small crack in the foundation of his worldview that would only grow in the days to come. As the day wore on, Brad found himself replaying the encounters with Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Anderson in his mind. Each time, he tried to justify his actions, to reinforce his belief that he was in the right. But with each repetition, the certainty of his convictions seemed to waver just a little bit more. Little did Brad know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about success, struggle, and the true value of human kindness. The lessons that lay ahead would shake him to his core, forcing him to confront the harsh realities of life and the consequences of his own arrogance. As night fell over Millbrook once again, three lives continued on their separate paths. Mr. Samuel, quietly persevering in his mission to help others despite his own hardships. Mrs. Anderson, determined to find a way to repay the kindness that had changed her life. And Brad, stubbornly clinging to his beliefs even as doubt began to creep in. The stage was set for a series of events that would intertwine their destinies, teaching powerful lessons about empathy, humility, and the unexpected ways in which life can turn the tables on even the most self-assured individuals. The weeks following Brad's confrontation with Mrs. Anderson passed in a blur of normalcy. He continued his deliveries, partied with friends, and maintained his smug attitude towards life. However, the seed of doubt planted by Mrs. Anderson's words had taken root, causing occasional moments of unease that Brad stubbornly pushed aside. It was a Tuesday morning when Brad's world began to crumble. He arrived at work to find a somber atmosphere and a notice on the restaurant's door, closed for renovations. Inside, his manager Mike broke the news. "I'm sorry, Brad," Mike said, his face etched with genuine regret. "The owners decided to downsize. We're letting go of all part-time staff, effective immediately." Brad stared at him in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? This is some kind of joke." Mike shook his head. "I wish it was. Here's your final paycheck and a letter of recommendation. I hope it helps you find something else quickly." As Brad left the restaurant, clutching his final paycheck, the reality of his situation began to sink in. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of real fear. But he quickly pushed it aside, replacing it with his usual bravado. "No big deal," he muttered to himself. "I'll have another job by the end of the week. Places are probably lining up to hire someone like me." But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Brad's confidence began to waver. Every job application seemed to end in rejection. His flashy resume, once a source of pride, now felt inadequate against the sea of more qualified candidates. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," became a phrase he heard all too often. "We're looking for someone with more experience in this field. Or worse, I'm afraid your attitude doesn't quite align with our company culture." As rejections piled up, Brad's frustration grew. He found himself snapping at friends, making excuses to avoid social gatherings he could no longer afford. His savings, once a comfortable cushion, dwindled alarmingly fast. One evening, staring at his nearly empty bank account, Brad made a difficult decision. He could no longer afford the trendy downtown apartment that had been his pride and joy. With a heavy heart, he began searching for cheaper accommodations. The apartment he eventually settled for was a far cry from his previous home. Located in a rundown part of town, it was a tiny studio with peeling wallpaper and a persistent smell of mold. As Brad lugged his few remaining possessions up the creaky stairs, he couldn't help but think of all the times he'd looked down on people living in places like this. It's just temporary, he told himself, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. I'll be back on my feet in no time. But as weeks turned into months, temporary began to feel increasingly permanent. Brad's job search grew more desperate. He applied for positions he would have scoffed at just months ago: fast food, janitorial work, anything that might bring in a paycheck. But even these seemed out of reach. His friends, once constant companions, began to drift away. Invitations became less frequent, and when they did come, Brad found himself making excuses. He couldn't bear the thought of them seeing him like this, of admitting how far he had fallen. One night, after another day of fruitless job hunting, Brad sat in his dingy apartment, staring at his empty refrigerator. His stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. His last few dollars had gone towards keeping the electricity on, leaving nothing for food. As hunger gnawed at him, a memory surfaced. The night he had mocked Mr. Samuel for digging through the dumpster behind Enzo's restaurant. The cruel words he had spoken echoed in his mind, now tinged with bitter irony. "Look at you, old man, scrounging for scraps like a stray dog. Pathetic." Brad closed his eyes, shame washing over him. How quickly the tables had turned. Now, he was the one facing hunger, the one desperate enough to consider options he once found revolting. For a long moment, Brad sat in the darkness of his apartment, wrestling with his pride. But hunger and desperation eventually won out. With a heavy heart, he pulled on his jacket and stepped out into the night. The walk to Enzo's restaurant felt like a march to the gallows. Every step was a battle between his growling stomach and his wounded pride. As he approached the familiar alley, Brad's heart raced. What if someone saw him? What if his former co-workers were still around? But the alley was deserted, silent except for the distant hum of traffic. Brad approached the dumpster, his hands shaking as he lifted the heavy lid. The smell that wafted out made his stomach churn, a mixture of rotting food and garbage. But beneath that, he caught whiffs of tomato sauce and garlic, remnants of the day's meals. Taking a deep breath, Brad began to sort through the trash, his movements clumsy and unsure. He found a half-eaten loaf of bread, slightly stale but still edible. A container of pasta, mostly untouched. An apple with only a small bruise. As he gathered these meager findings, tears began to roll down Brad's cheeks. The full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. This was what he had become, the very thing he had once mocked and despised. The shame and hopelessness were overwhelming. "It's not as easy as it looks, is it, son?" The gentle voice startled Brad so badly, he nearly fell into the dumpster. He whirled around, clutching his pitiful haul to his chest, to find himself face to face with Mr. Samuel. The old man stood there, his kind eyes filled with understanding rather than judgment. In his hands, he held a small canvas bag, similar to the one Brad had seen him with months ago. "Mr. Samuel," Brad stammered, his cheeks burning with shame. I can explain." But Mr. Samuel held up a hand, stopping Brad's fumbling excuses. "There's no need to explain, young man. I recognize hunger when I see it." He glanced at the food in Brad's arms, then back at the young man's tear-stained face. "Why don't you come with me? I know a place where we can get you a proper meal." Brad hesitated, his pride warring with his desperate need for kindness. "Why would you help me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After the way I treated you?" Mr. Samuel's smile was gentle, tinged with a sadness that spoke of deep understanding. "Because everyone needs a little help sometimes. And because holding on to anger only weighs us down. Now come, let's get you fed." Reluctantly, Brad followed Mr. Samuel out of the alley. They walked in silence through the quiet streets, Brad's mind whirling with a mixture of shame, gratitude, and disbelief at the turn his life had taken. After a few blocks, they arrived at a small, nondescript building. A sign above the door read, "Milbur Community Kitchen." Mr. Samuel led Brad inside, where the warm aroma of home-cooked food filled the air. "Welcome to my other home," Mr. Samuel said, gesturing around the room. A few tables were set up, and a small serving area stood at one end. I volunteer here most nights. We serve meals to anyone who needs them, no questions asked. Brad looked around, taking in the simple but clean surroundings. A few other people were scattered about, eating quietly or talking in low voices. None of them gave Brad a second glance, for which he was intensely grateful. Mr. Samuel guided Brad to a table, then disappeared into the kitchen. He returned moments later with a tray holding a steaming bowl of soup, a sandwich, and a cup of coffee. "Eat," he said kindly, setting the tray in front of Brad. Food always tastes better when you're sharing it with others. The smell of the food broke through the last of Brad's resistance. He began to eat, at first slowly, then with increasing urgency as his body responded to the nourishment it so desperately needed. Mr. Samuel sat across from him, sipping his own coffee and waiting patiently. As Brad finished his meal, the full impact of Mr. Samuel's kindness hit him. Here was the man he had cruelly mocked, now showing him compassion when he needed it most. The contrast between his own behavior and Mr. Samuel's generosity was stark and humbling. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Brad broke down. Sobs racked his body as months of stress, fear, and shame poured out of him. Mr. Samuel moved to sit beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Brad choked out between sobs. "The way I treated you, the things I said, I was so wrong. I didn't understand. I never imagined I could end up like this." Mr. Samuel's voice was soft, filled with compassion. Life is a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn, even if they're not the lessons we want. There's no shame in struggling, son. The shame is in refusing to learn from our experiences. Brad looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "How can you be so kind to me after what I did? I don't deserve your help." Mr. Samuel smiled gently. "Kindness isn't about deserving, Brad. It's about recognizing the humanity in each other, even when it's hard to see. We've all made mistakes, said things we regret. The question is, what do we do with those experiences? Do we let them make us bitter, or do we let them make us better?" His words struck a chord deep within Brad. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of his past actions, the hurt he had caused not just to Mr. Samuel, but to countless others he had judged without knowing their stories. "I want to be better," Brad said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be that person anymore. But I don't know how to change." Mr. Samuel nodded, his eyes twinkling with warmth. Recognizing the need for change is the first step, and often the hardest one. The rest, well, that's a journey we all take one day at a time. And it's not a journey you have to take alone. He gestured around the community kitchen. This place isn't just about feeding empty stomachs. It's about nourishing souls, rebuilding lives. If you're willing to put in the work, to open your heart and learn, there's always a place for you here. Brad looked around the room with new eyes, seeing beyond the simple furnishings to the spirit of community and hope that filled the space. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of something he had thought lost forever. Hope. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I want to learn, to help, to make amends for the person I was." Mr. Samuel squeezed his shoulder gently. "Then welcome to the family, Brad. We start each day at 6 a.m., preparing breakfast for our early visitors. Think you can handle that?" A small smile, the first genuine one in months, tugged at Brad's lips. "Yes, sir. I'll be here." As they stood to leave, Brad felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he didn't feel alone on the journey. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to redefine himself and his place in the world. Walking out into the cool night air, Brad turned to Mr. Samuel. "Thank you," he said, pouring every ounce of sincerity he possessed into those two words. "For everything. I promise I won't let you down." Mr. Samuel's smile was warm and reassuring. "I know you won't, son. Just remember, we're all works in progress. The important thing is to keep moving forward, one step at a time." As they parted ways, Brad felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He still had a long way to go, many amends to make, and much to learn. But tonight, in the simple act of sharing a meal and receiving undeserved kindness, he had taken the first step on a new path. Walking back to his small apartment, Brad's mind was filled not with despair, but with plans for the future. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to learn, to grow, and to become the kind of person who lifts others up instead of tearing them down. For the first time in months, Brad fell asleep with a sense of purpose, the echo of Mr. Samuel's words playing in his mind. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. He vowed to remember that lesson, to carry it with him as he embarked on this new chapter of his life. The early morning sun cast a soft glow over Millbrook as Brad made his way to the community kitchen. True to his word, he arrived just before 6 a.m., nervous energy coursing through his veins. As he approached the building, he saw Mr. Samuel unlocking the front door, a warm smile spreading across the older man's face when he spotted Brad. "Good morning, son," Mr. Samuel greeted him. "I'm glad to see you here. Ready to get started?" Brad nodded, trying to mask his anxiety with determination. "Yes, sir. I'm ready to learn and help in any way I can." Mr. Samuel led Brad into the kitchen, where a few other volunteers were already bustling about, preparing for the morning rush. As they worked side by side, chopping vegetables and stirring large pots of oatmeal, Mr. Samuel shared stories of his life, the struggles he'd faced, and the people he'd met along the way. "You know, Brad," Mr. Samuel said as they worked, "everyone makes mistakes. It's part of being human. The true test of character isn't in never falling, but in how we pick ourselves up and grow from those experiences." Brad paused his chopping, looking at Mr. Samuel with a mixture of gratitude and shame. "I still can't believe you're giving me this chance after how I treated you. I don't know if I could be so forgiving." Mr. Samuel's smile was gentle but firm. "Forgiveness isn't always easy, but it's necessary. Holding on to anger and resentment only weighs us down. Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "kindness is a cycle that should never be broken, even if others don't initially understand it." As the days passed, Brad threw himself into his work at the community kitchen. He arrived early each morning, eager to learn and help in any way he could. The physical labor was exhausting, but Brad found it oddly satisfying. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. One morning, about 2 weeks into Brad's volunteer work, a familiar face walked through the door of the community kitchen. Mrs. Anderson, dressed in her usual elegant attire, surveyed the room until her eyes landed on Brad. For a moment, he froze, remembering their last encounter. But to his surprise, Mrs. Anderson's face softened into a warm smile. "Hello, Brad," she said, approaching him. "Mr. Samuel told me I might find you here. Do you have a moment to talk?" Nervously, Brad nodded, following Mrs. Anderson to a quiet corner of the room. She sat down, gesturing for him to join her. "I heard about what happened," Mrs. Anderson began, her voice gentle. "I'm sorry you've fallen on hard times, but I'm proud of you for being here, for trying to make a difference." Brad swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I don't deserve your kindness, Mrs. Anderson. Not after how I behaved." Mrs. Anderson reached out, patting his hand gently. "Brad, do you remember what I told you about Mr. Samuel? About how he helped me and my mother when we had nothing?" Brad nodded, unable to speak. "Well, there's something I want you to understand," Mrs. Anderson continued. "The lesson Mr. Samuel taught me all those years ago wasn't just about giving to others. It was about understanding that true strength lies not in wealth or status, but in compassion and humility." She paused, letting her words sink in. "You're learning that lesson now, Brad. It's not an easy one, but it's perhaps the most important lesson any of us can learn." Brad looked up, meeting Mrs. Anderson's kind gaze. "I want to be better," he said softly. "I want to make amends for the person I was." Mrs. Anderson smiled. "That desire, Brad, is the first step towards real change. And from what Mr. Samuel tells me, you're already well on your way." As the weeks turned into months, Brad's transformation became more and more apparent. He threw himself into his work at the community kitchen with a passion that surprised even himself. He learned to cook nutritious meals on a budget, to stretch resources to feed as many people as possible, and most importantly, to listen to the stories of those he served without judgment. One day, as Brad was serving soup to a young mother and her children, he overheard a conversation that would change the course of his life once again. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Mr. Samuel was saying to an elderly woman. "We're running low on supplies this week. I'm afraid we might have to cut back on our meal services for a few days." The woman's face fell, and Brad felt a pang in his heart. He remembered all too well the gnawing pain of hunger, the desperation that had driven him to search through dumpsters for food. Without thinking, he approached Mr. Samuel. "What if we did a food drive?" Brad suggested. "I could make some flyers, spread the word on social media. Maybe we could get the community involved." Mr. Samuel's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Brad. But it's a big undertaking. Are you sure you're up for it?" Brad nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "I want to do this, Mr. Samuel. I want to give back, to make a real difference." With Mr. Samuel's blessing, Brad threw himself into organizing the food drive. He designed flyers, created social media campaigns, and even reached out to local businesses for support. To his surprise and delight, the community responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. As donations poured in, Brad found himself sharing his story with others. He spoke openly about his past arrogance, his fall from grace, and the kindness that had saved him from despair. His honesty and vulnerability touched people's hearts, inspiring them to get involved and make a difference. The day of the food drive arrived, and the turnout was beyond anything Brad or Mr. Samuel had imagined. The line of people bringing donations stretched around the block. Local news crews arrived to cover the event, interviewing Brad about what had inspired him to organize such a massive community effort. Standing in front of the cameras, Brad felt a mix of nervousness and pride. "I used to think success was all about money and status," he said, his voice steady. "But I've learned that true success comes from helping others, from being part of a community that cares for one another." He went on to share his story, not sparing himself in recounting his past mistakes and the valuable lessons he'd learned. As he spoke, he could see people in the crowd nodding, some wiping away tears. "We all go through hard times," Brad concluded. "But what I've learned from Mr. Samuel and this incredible community is that we don't have to face those times alone. Together, we can make sure that no one in Millbrook ever has to go hungry or feel abandoned." The food drive was a resounding success, bringing in enough donations to keep the community kitchen well-stocked for months. But more than that, it sparked a change in Millbrook. Inspired by Brad's story and Mr. Samuel's lifelong dedication to helping others, people began to look for ways to get involved and make a difference. In the weeks that followed, Brad found himself flooded with messages from people wanting to volunteer, donate, or simply share their own stories of struggle and redemption. He realized that by opening up about his own journey, he had created a space for others to do the same. With the support of Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Anderson, Brad began to organize regular community events. They set up a mentorship program, pairing struggling individuals with those who had overcome similar challenges. They established a job training initiative, helping people develop skills and find employment opportunities. The community kitchen became more than just a place to get a meal. It transformed into a hub of support, education, and hope. People from all walks of life came together, breaking down barriers of class and prejudice that had long divided the community. One evening, as Brad was locking up the kitchen after a busy day, Mr. Samuel approached him with a twinkle in his eye. "You know, son," he said, "when I first met you, I never would have imagined we'd end up here." Brad chuckled, shaking his head. "Me neither. I was such a different person then." Mr. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Brad. But what impresses me most isn't just how much you've changed. It's how you've used your experience to help others change, too." Brad felt a warmth spread through his chest at Mr. Samuel's words. "I had a good teacher," he said softly. Mr. Samuel laughed, clapping Brad on the shoulder. "We're all teachers and students in this life, son. The important thing is to keep learning and keep passing those lessons on." As they walked out into the cool evening air, Brad looked around at the neighborhood he now called home. He saw beyond the worn buildings and cracked sidewalks to the vibrant community that pulsed with life and hope. He thought about how far he'd come, from a self-centered young man who mocked others' misfortune to someone who now dedicated his life to lifting others up. "You know, Mr. Samuel," Brad said as they parted ways, "I used to think I had it all figured out. But now I realize I'm just at the beginning of understanding what really matters in life." Mr. Samuel smiled, his eyes twinkling with wisdom and affection. "That, my boy, is the most important lesson of all. Never stop learning, never stop growing, and never stopped believing in the power of kindness to change lives. As Brad walked home that night, he felt a deep sense of peace and purpose. He knew that the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. He was part of something bigger than himself, a community bound together by compassion, resilience, and hope. The transformation that had begun with one act of kindness in a dark alley had rippled out, touching countless lives and reshaping an entire community. And as Brad drifted off to sleep that night, he made a silent promise to himself and to all those who had helped him along the way, to keep the cycle of kindness going, to never forget the lessons he'd learned, and to always strive to be a light for others in their darkest moments. The Millbrook Community Center buzzed with excitement as people from all walks of life gathered for the annual charity gala organized by Mrs. Anderson's Foundation. The large hall was beautifully decorated, with twinkling lights and colorful banners celebrating the theme of the evening, building bridges of compassion. Brad, now a respected community leader himself, stood near the back of the room, watching the crowd with a sense of wonder. He couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in the past few years, not just in the community, but within himself. As the crowd settled into their seats, Mrs. Anderson took the stage, her elegant presence commanding attention. She smiled warmly at the audience, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mr. Samuel, seated in the front row. "Good evening, everyone," Mrs. Anderson began, her voice filled with emotion. "Tonight, we're here to celebrate the power of kindness and the impact one person can have on an entire community. But before we begin, I'd like to share a personal story with you all, a story about a man who changed the course of my life when I was just a little girl." A hush fell over the room as Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Many of you know Mr. Samuel Johnson," she continued, gesturing to where he sat. "You know him as the kind soul who runs our community kitchen, the man who never turns away anyone in need. But what you may not know is that long before he was helping our entire community, he saved my family from despair." Mrs. Anderson's voice wavered slightly as she recounted the story of her childhood, the struggle of growing up with a single mother, the constant fear of hunger and homelessness. As she spoke, Brad found himself transported back to that day outside the restaurant when she had first shared this story with him. But hearing it now, in this context, gave it a new depth of meaning. "We had nothing," Mrs. Anderson said, tears glistening in her eyes. "No food, no hope, no future. And then, one day, we walked into a small grocery store run by a kind-hearted man named Samuel Johnson." She paused, looking directly at Mr. Samuel, whose own eyes were brimming with tears. "Mr. Samuel didn't just give us food that day. He gave us hope. He extended credit to my mother when no one else would. He encouraged me to stay in school, to dream big, to believe in myself. Without his kindness, without his unwavering support, I wouldn't be standing here today." A ripple of emotion passed through the crowd. Brad could see people wiping away tears, reaching out to hold hands with their neighbors. "Mr. Samuel taught me that true strength lies not in wealth or status, but in compassion and humility," Mrs. Anderson continued. "He showed me that one act of kindness can change a life, and that changed life can go on to change an entire community." With that, Mrs. Anderson extended her hand towards Mr. Samuel. "Mr. Samuel, would you please join me on stage?" The crowd erupted in applause as Mr. Samuel, looking both touched and slightly embarrassed by the attention, made his way to the stage. As he reached Mrs. Anderson, she enveloped him in a warm embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "Thank you for being the guiding light in my life when everything seemed dark." The two stood there for a moment, their embrace symbolizing the powerful impact of kindness rippling across generations. The audience rose to their feet, the applause growing into a thunderous standing ovation. As Brad watched this emotional scene unfold, he felt a lump form in his throat. He thought back to the arrogant young man he had once been, the cruel words he had spoken to Mr. Samuel in that alley. The contrast between that moment and this one was stark, a testament to how much he had grown and learned. After the applause died down and Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Anderson had taken their seats, Brad found himself called to the stage to share his own story. As he stood before the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all united in this moment. He felt a surge of gratitude. A few years ago, Brad began, his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. I stood in an alley behind a restaurant and mocked a man for digging through a dumpster for food. That man was Mr. Samuel Johnson. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Brad continued, recounting his fall from grace, the desperation that had driven him to that same dumpster, and the unexpected kindness Mr. Samuel had shown him in his darkest hour. Mr. Samuel had every right to turn his back on me that night, Brad said, his voice thick with emotion, to show me the same cruelty I had shown him. But instead, he offered me a hand and said, "Everyone needs a little help sometimes." Brad paused, letting the words sink in. That night changed everything for me. It set me on a path of transformation, teaching me that true strength isn't about tearing others down, but lifting them up. As he concluded his speech, Brad looked directly at Mr. Samuel. "You told me once that kindness is a cycle that should never be broken. I promise you, Mr. Samuel, I will spend the rest of my life keeping that cycle going." The room erupted in applause once more. As Brad made his way off the stage, he was met by Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Anderson. The three of them stood together, united in their shared experiences and their commitment to spreading compassion throughout their community. In that moment, looking at Mr. Samuel's kind eyes and Mrs. Anderson's proud smile, Brad felt a sense of peace wash over him. He realized that this connection, this purpose, this ability to make a difference, was what he had been searching for all along, even when he didn't know it. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Brad found himself standing outside the community center with Mr. Samuel and Mrs. Anderson. The night air was cool and crisp, filled with the promise of new beginnings. "You know," Mr. Samuel said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when I first started helping people all those years ago, I never imagined it would lead to all this." He gestured broadly, encompassing not just the building behind them, but the entire community they had helped to transform. Mrs. Anderson smiled, linking her arm through Mr. Samuel's. "That's the beauty of kindness, isn't it? You never know how far it will reach or how many lives it will touch." Brad nodded, feeling the truth of her words deep in his soul. "I used to think success was about how much you could get for yourself," he said. "Now I know it's about how much you can give to others." The three of them stood there for a moment longer, gazing out at the neighborhood they had all played a part in transforming. The streets that had once seemed so bleak to Brad now felt alive with possibility. As they prepared to part ways for the evening, Mr. Samuel turned to Brad and Mrs. Anderson, his eyes twinkling with warmth and wisdom. "Remember," he said, "every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always." Brad let those words sink in, knowing he would carry them with him always. As he walked home that night, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. From a self-centered young man to a community leader dedicated to helping others, he had experienced firsthand the transformative power of kindness and second chances. He thought about all the people in their community and beyond who were still struggling, still in need of that same kindness and understanding. And he renewed his commitment to being there for them, to continuing the cycle of compassion that Mr. Samuel had started so many years ago. As Brad reached his apartment, he paused for a moment, looking up at the night sky. The stars seemed brighter somehow, as if reflecting the hope and purpose he now felt in his heart. "Thank you," he whispered to the universe, grateful for the lessons he had learned, the growth he had experienced, and the opportunity to make a difference in the world. With a smile on his face and determination in his heart, Brad entered his home, ready to rest and prepare for another day of serving his community. He knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be more people to help, more bridges to build, more kindness to spread. But he also knew that he wasn't alone on this journey. He had Mr. Samuel's wisdom, Mrs. Anderson's support, and an entire community of people committed to lifting each other up. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Brad's mind echoed with the words that had become his life's motto: "Kindness is a cycle that should never be broken." And he vowed, once again, to keep that cycle going, one act of compassion at a time. In the days and weeks that followed, the story of Mr. Samuel, Mrs. Anderson, and Brad's intertwined journey spread throughout Millbrook and beyond. It served as a powerful reminder that everyone has a story, that appearances can be deceiving, and that a single act of kindness can set in motion a chain of events that transforms not just individual lives, but entire communities. People who heard their story were inspired to look at their own lives differently, to seek out opportunities to help others, and to approach strangers with empathy rather than judgment. The ripple effect of their shared experiences continued to expand, touching lives far beyond the borders of their small town. And so, the tale of Millbrook's transformation became more than just a local success story. It became a beacon of hope, a call to action for people everywhere to practice empathy, to give second chances, and to remember that beneath every struggle lies a human story waiting to be understood. In the end, the greatest lesson learned was this: that in a world often divided by differences, kindness has the power to unite, to heal, and to create a brighter future for all. And it begins with each one of us, choosing compassion over judgment, understanding over assumption, and love over fear, one small act of kindness at a time. What would you do if you found yourself in Brad's shoes, faced with a moment that would force you to question everything you thought you knew about life, kindness, and second chances? Would you have the strength to admit your mistakes and accept the hand of someone you once looked down on? If this story of redemption, humility, and the power of compassion touched your heart, please consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my soul into sharing these powerful stories that remind us all of the humanity in each of us, and your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.